May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Please be seated, my friends. In Lent, we accompany Christ in his time in the wilderness. Today, the wilderness is embodied by a single fig tree that has turned back to wild, wild ways. We are left unknowing what will happen to the fig tree in the parable and whether it will return to fruitful domestication at all. And yet, it's not only Christ who we encounter in the wilderness. Today, we find the prophet Moses in a wild place. We meet him out on the land, caring for his father-in-law's flock of sheep on what must have begun as an ordinary workday. And there on the mountainside, his life changes in an instant and will never be the same again. For many Christians, this passage is among the most familiar of the Hebrew Bible, alongside the account of Adam and Eve and the creation itself. But it can hold such richness for us if we encounter it as if it were the first time. So let us sink into it. Feel the hot desert air, the sandy soil under our feet. Hear the crackling of fire, the trembling voice of Moses. And let us listen for the voice of God echoing through the millennia as we investigate what it means for our lives to be set ablaze by God and yet not be consumed. As we take off our shoes with Moses and draw near to the burning bush, we hear God calling Moses by name, not once, but twice, as if to really get his attention. And Moses does his best to resist the divine invitation, hiding his face and asking, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" I wonder, have you ever asked yourself a question like that? I have, and often. Who am I to be a priest? Who am I to be a disciple of God? Who am I when faced with the great I am? I wonder what your who am I questions have been, and what internal resistance you have felt as the answers welled up in your heart. In the resistance of Moses to God, we find the most relatable, the most utterly human of prophets. He objects to God's call not just once, but over and over. The first time is the "who am I that I should do this" question, and the second is his belief that the people will not believe that he speaks for God. And then he starts trying to negotiate with God, asking for God to at least give him God's name, the holiest of holy words that could not be written in full or spoken aloud. And yet, in response to this audacious ask, God gives it to Moses in the first person. I am who I am. God gives Moses his name and tells him exactly what to say to the Israelites. But it's still not enough. Moses will make yet another objection right after our passage from today. And after so many objections, God finally gets a little bit angry and assigns Moses a helper, Aaron, finally convincing him to take on this monumental task with the buddy system. Despite his numerous objections and the audacity of speaking to God so boldly, God never gives up on Moses. Instead, God meets him at each juncture, encourages him, and offers him the help he needs to take on such a task. Though the intensity of God's call blazes all around him, Moses is not consumed. Instead, his heart is enkindled. and he is drawn into intimate conversation with God. The conversation is so intimate, so deeply personal, that it begins inside Moses' head, and we are given insight into that. He spots the burning bush and says to himself, I must turn aside and look at this great sight. And it's here that the dialogue with God begins. The passage continues. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. We first heard Moses' inner monologue, and now we are given just a little insight into what God may be thinking in response. Almost peering into the divine consciousness. The Old Testament theologian Ellen F. Davis proposes that it is Moses' conscious resolve to turn aside and investigate this great sight that prompts God to speak to him for the first time. I find the thought of God responding to us and deciding to engage and even change course to be just as miraculous as the burning bush itself. And equally wondrous is God's compassion for God's people. God chooses to share with Moses that God has observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt and has decided to act in the world through Moses, an ordinary and very fallible human. Our God, the God of Moses, has the capacity to be touched by his people's suffering and to be moved to help them through a faithful human being. That is wonderful news to my mind, but it means that any of us can be called to do the very same. We may also be called to radically change course, as Moses was. After all, Moses had been a resident alien living in Midian, peacefully abiding as a family man and as a shepherd. And that whole life goes up in smoke for Moses and will never be the same. And yet, Moses has always been one to wildly change course, to turn aside from any beaten path. As a young man, he fled into the wilderness after he killed an Egyptian overseer who he saw beating a Hebrew slave and made that new life in Midian. He derailed himself permanently and will soon do it again at the burning bush. Maybe that is why God is drawn to him, since God often proves willing to do the same for our sake. It is not only in the New Testament that we find a God who is willing to change course, to come down to our level, and to help us and love us in the flesh. Here in Exodus, God leaps off the path in pursuit of a profoundly intimate relationship with a human being, a relationship which empowers Moses to liberate and lead the Israelite community into new life, albeit by a long, long road. One way that this intimacy with God is shown to us is through the dialogue, the interchange between Moses and God, in which both interlocutors kind of negotiate with one another until they reach a shared vision of what Moses will do. The intimacy is also revealed in the physicality of the passage. Moses not only turns aside to view the burning bush and to come close to God's presence, but takes off his sandals to do so. The removal of shoes was a common custom in the ancient world when entering into a holy place, but for the Israelites, it was more intense. Trespassing on holy ground meant instant death. In the temple, the high priest took his very life into his hands when entering the Holy of Holies one day each year. For who could see God and live? And yet, Moses spoke And yet God spoke to Moses face to face, even as one speaks to a friend, as described later in Exodus, and even mouth to mouth, as recounted in the book of Numbers. To ancient audiences, such intimacy with God was death-defying, earth-shaking, something that should utterly destroy and consume a human being. And yet, time and again, God chooses to come down to us, to meet us at our own level, not to utterly overwhelm us, but to comfort and strengthen us with the closeness of God's presence. I am who I am, God assures us. I am here. I am with you. I am present to your suffering, your prayers, your hope. And all we must say to God in return is, here I am, and there God will be. God's voice echoes through the millennia, from the burning bush, through the incarnation of Christ, and breaks through into our lives today with the good news of God's abiding presence with us. I am who I am, says God, and what I am is present here with you. Ellen Davis argues that the essence of the gospel is heard already from the burning bush. God has come down to holy ground to deliver us and to bring us to new life. Long before Mary, Moses knew God most intimately, in a way that mortal flesh should not be able to endure, and yet does. St. Gregory of Nyssa saw the burning bush and the God-bearing body of Mary as ultimately one revelation from God, separated only in time. And although their lives were set alight and transformed by God's purpose, they were not consumed. Their lives were uplifted and transformed by the refining fire of God's love and purpose. Their task was simply to find the courage to say, here I am. Well, my friends, here I am, and here are we. As we find ourselves and our communities in a wilderness time, in a shifting landscape of what it means to be neighbors and citizens and people of faith, our certainty about everything we thought we knew may be ablaze. It is ours to redefine who we are, to say to God and to one another, here I am, even if our voice shakes. We can trust that our God is with us in our fear, in our reluctance, in our faltering steps on the path towards God. For just as God met Moses exactly where he was, God will meet us wherever we are. God continually invites us to pause, to take off our sandals or whatever is keeping us from feeling the holiness of this moment. For wherever we are, we stand on holy ground, a place radiant with God's love in us. And so, as we continue our journey through Lent, let us consider how we will be willing for our hearts and minds to be set alight with a divine fire, that we may be beacons of light and love and warmth to those around us. For our God is on fire with love for us and will not abandon us in the wilderness, even the wilderness of our own making. For God is with us on the way of the cross, waiting to fire our hearts with God's own mercy, justice, and love. May we trust that when we offer ourselves to alleviate the suffering of any member of creation, God will not leave us to be consumed by despair or adversity. God was and is and ever shall be with us to enkindle our hearts and awaken our hope, even in the darkest of nights. If we choose to say, "Here I am," that same God will abide with us always. For God is the light within the fire that never dies away. Amen.